If I ask you to describe the connection between wellness and policing and community safety, you might struggle to construct an answer. Unless you're inside an agency, it is genuinely hard to see how the presence or absence of wellness shapes officers and through them the people they serve. But that is where we are going today. Chief David Lash of Northern York Regional Police and Chief David Steffen, former Chief of Northern Lancaster Regional Police, are going to talk about what happens when wellness moves from a stated value to a daily practice and how that shift affects team, culture, and by extension, the community. Too often, wellness is named as a value but withers under the weight of daily operations. Chief Lash has been speaking about wellness initiatives for years, but it was the tragic events of 2025 when multiple officers were lost in York County, Pennsylvania, several within his own agency, that gave the word wellness a new and more real meaning. A big part of this story is about the bonds officers form when they show up for one another in the worst circumstances. In equal measure, it is a story about leadership in those moments and why leaders must understand their own relationship to wellness before they can help others find theirs. Chief Steffen has been a constant in Chief Lash's life for 25 years. First as field training officer, then his colleague, now his friend and peer. This story cannot be told without him. There is a moment in our conversation with Chief Steffen describes a phone call that lasted 3 words. You will hear it. It tells you almost everything about what real wellness infrastructure looks like. And finally, we talk about what it means for a community to have police officers who are working on their mental fitness alongside their physical fitness. Because wellness at its root is the capacity to be in good relationship with colleagues, families, and with the community you serve. Let's get started. I'd like to start out today just setting the scene in terms of how you two know each other. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship and where you began in terms of getting to know one another?
I'll let you start, Dave.
Well, I don't even know the date of it, but a young college kid came into our department just out of college. We hired him, and I became Dave Lash as one of his field training officers, and I was one of the corporals that was supervising his shift. And then further downstream, I was in charge of the criminal investigations unit and developed a forensic program that was really pretty forward leading edge. And Dave was a major part of that. And together we've processed some pretty horrendous scenes. And at the end of the day, we did everything right. Then at some point, I decided I was tired of taking tests because I was going to retire. And Dave became a lieutenant that was my supervisor, which everything kind of goes full circle in police departments. And when I finally did retire and became a chief, later on, he became a chief, but we've always remained close friends and colleagues throughout the process.
Yeah.
We've known each other for 25 years. Dave's both a mentor to me as well as a very good friend and a peer. I like to joke that over my career, he probably got me out of as much trouble as he potentially got me into during certain incidents. We had a heck of a road together, and as Dave said, we saw some pretty nasty things, and we worked through those together and developed a forensic program and just developed a friendship that can't be beat. I appreciate everything he's done for me.
A large part of that, too, was sharing ideas and not being afraid to bounce an idea off of each other. The accreditation piece was a big part of all of that. And, we've had a very, very worthwhile run together. Let's say it that way.
And just for the audience, for Pennsylvania, the Northern York Regional Police Department was it broke down all kinds of barriers in terms of understanding what a regional police department could look like. So you guys were very much in the Commonwealth center of that movement. That's how I recall it. And I also will add that when I've had a long history with working in Lancaster County, and the first time I heard Chief Steffen's name was from Lancaster County managers who talked about forming the regional police department. And that was pretty exciting that they were going to take that step. I met Chief Stephan. We did a podcast episode together, which I'll put in the notes if anybody wants to go back and listen to that. But I'm really happy that I'm now introduced to Chief Lash. And I think this is going to be a very interesting episode. And I know from my notes here that you both worked on wellness together at the Pennsylvania Chiefs of Police. So somehow you connected again. But I think it requires us just to take a moment to say, what would even make that topic become important at this moment? What's been happening that this is brought to the attention of your state association?
Wellness has been a big part of the PA Chiefs for I'm going to say the last 10 years and definitely the last 5 years, starting back when Chief Stephan was president. We've seen a change in culture over the years in law enforcement. 25, 30 years ago, it was, get yourself up, brush yourself off, go back to work. Everything was going to be fine. And that's just the way we dealt with everything. And now we move into, and I don't like to get into the generations and the millennials, the X's. I don't think that's the thing. I think what has happened is as a society, we've just become more in tune with wellness. And it took us a while in law enforcement to catch up to that. And we've brought that to the forefront here in the last 5 years. My predecessor is the president of the PA Chiefs, Mike Vogel from Allegheny County. Well, big thing for Mike's year that he was president and as he continues to be the chairman of our executive board. And we echoed onto that for my term in 2025 to 2026 is that we're continuing to push wellness. And we've actually pushed out on a statewide level a wellness committee that is drawing up resources that we're sharing with law enforcement officers and chiefs all across the Commonwealth. And continuing to normalize that discussion on officer wellness. And I think that's probably the biggest step we've taken, and even in our own agency, is to start to normalize those discussions and to ask people if they're okay. And that's something that we're just opening up to here. All police officers are difficult to get them to accept change. They're difficult to convince them that you're doing things for the right reasons. And, it takes a little bit of salesmanship to get some of that stuff over at times.
In my preliminary talks with both of you, I stressed this idea that wellness and safety culture is talked about, but it's rarely converted into tangible assets to bring to the organization or measurable results. So we're going to get into this and exactly how you move the needle here in wellness. And unfortunately, before we get into some of those particulars of what happened within your force, let's just say a little bit more about both your perspectives. So officers 20, 30 years ago, if you were to describe the culture, particularly as it relates to this idea of wellness, how would each of you describe that?
It might have been a concept, but it was a foreign one. We generally, just as Chief Lash said, got up, smiled. We're thankful that we made it through whatever it was we were having as a critical event and went back to work. And that was how it was handled. That was the expectation. And that wasn't just at Northern York Regional. That was the industry standard back in the day. And then suddenly we had a standard put into the accreditation requirements for officer wellness. And that was always the proof that every chief that I knew that was associated with that always kind of scratched their head and said, hey, what do we got to do here to prove that we're compliant with this? Well, no more. That's really now one of the easy checkoff blocks, and for the better. It just is.
How does that contrast with your understanding, Chief Lash?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think it came down to, it wasn't an organizationally approved or sanctioned wellness 25, 30 years ago. But I think when I look back on the things that I experienced as a young police officer and the people I experienced them with, as a group, we were always there for each other. We didn't have a term to put to it. But, I remember Dave and I, we had a horrific crime where a young girl was killed in a bathtub. And he and I spent a lot of time on that case and collected a lot of forensic evidence and spent a lot of time together. And we were constantly checking on each other, making sure we were okay. And this was before cell phones, right? So you couldn't text, you couldn't call. We actually had to talk face to face or call. But I think we did it pretty well as a small group or individual to individual based upon the relationship. I just don't think it was ever embraced at the organizational level. And as Chief Stephan said, I think that was not just statewide, that's a countrywide phenomenon for wellness. Is that just wasn't, things that were talked about openly. Yeah, it was talked about in small settings and groups, maybe, drinking a beer after a bad case together and working through some things. But, it just wasn't organizationally there. And I think that's one of the big changes that we've seen here recently.
I'm going to move into it's kind of maybe difficult to talk about. So I want listeners to understand that your department has gone through a difficult period, and I hope that you could share with us some of that journey that you've been through. I guess my first question is that going into, would you say it was 2025? I guess we're going to really focus on going into 2025. Did you have some of this in place, some of this foundational understanding of what you wanted to do with wellness in place?
Yeah, I mean, we had some things in place. We had employee assistance programs. We had wellness apps. 2025 started off on a high note for us. We were in the process of building a new police station with wellness embedded into that new police station. We were opening up, it was going to have a fitness center in it. It was going to have a physical training center as well. So wellness was on the background. As 2025 continued to unfold, especially here in York County, wellness became even more to the forefront. We go back to February 22nd of 2025. That really opened the eyes in York County to wellness. That was the UPMC memorial shooting here in York. It not only affected our agency, but affected about 12 others that responded to that scene. We had an officer from a neighboring department killed during that shooting, as well as one of our officers and another officer from a neighboring department also wounded. So seeing the community start to come together, seeing the law enforcement community coming together, and the resources that came out after the UPMC shooting was really starting to be an eye-opener, and people were starting to have that dialogue back and forth between the agencies and between therapists and other CISM groups that were in the community at that time.
Let me just stop you there because there's going to be listeners and anyone can look up that date, February 22nd, 2025, UPMC, York County. But I think just to give some insight to our listeners as to what happened that day, and I don't know if you want to do that, Chief Lash.
Yeah, I can take that. February 22nd, 2025 started off as a normal February day. It was actually very nice out that day. It was a rather warm February day. And, around 10 a.m., 10:46 to be exact, the 911 center started receiving phone calls of an active shooter in the ICU at UPMC Memorial Hospital. That is not in our jurisdiction. It's in a neighboring jurisdiction. It's actually right across the street from one of our municipalities. So, when incidents like that occur, that's a come one, come all dispatch by the 911 center. So, approximately 60 police officers from around York County, the Pennsylvania State Police, agencies from Cumberland County and Dauphin County responded to UPMC Memorial to handle a lone shooter in the ICU. And when officers first arrived on scene, the shooting had stopped. It basically became more of a hostage situation. So officers surrounded the ICU, had it contained into the ICU area. They were able to start to try to at least negotiate and build a little bit of rapport with the shooter. When that broke down, the officers on scene made a tactical decision to try to make entry into the ICU. Once they got in through the initial doors, they were met with an assailant that had a gun to a woman's head, threatening to kill her if the officers didn't back out. So the officers backed out, reassembled in the hallway, and were discussing their next tactical options to make a second attack on the ICU when the gunman brought the fight to them, forced the hostage through the double doors out into the hallway, which was filled with police officers, stating he was going to kill this woman, still holding a gun to her head. And the officers on scene engaged that subject and neutralized him. But in the aftermath of that, one police officer lay dead, two additional police officers lay wounded, and we immediately had to transition from that active assailant role to a rescue role and getting the first aid and necessary treatment to those officers to get them out of there, to get them to a hospital for further treatment.
So there was I'll never forget that day. It was a really just shocking scene. What does that set into motion for those of us who don't know how this operates in a police department? You've got someone that's killed, others that are wounded. What is your department doing now in the aftermath of that?
The first hours of that after we were concentrating more on the wellness of the two officers that were injured, making sure they were properly protected, making sure we weren't going to have an additional attack somewhere else in York County or at the other hospital where the police officers were being. And then starting to bring in the resources that we needed, whether they were CISM teams from the county, CISM teams from outside the county. Members Assistance Program from the Pennsylvania State Police arrived on scene and started coordinating all of that aftercare and wellness care. And there's a very specific steps we use after an officer involved shooting in our agency that lays that out. We need to have that diffusing. That's an initial talking for the officer to talk to someone and get themselves at a level where they're feeling not right and not perfect, but they're feeling a lot better and that they can start that coping process. And then a couple of days later, we do a debriefing and we continue moving through that with follow-up care. But the hour or two that followed that shooting on February, it was very chaotic and we had a lot of moving pieces just because of the amount of people that were there and the amount of people that were affected. And then we also had the hospital workers and the patients to consider and how are we getting them assistance as well. So there was a lot of dynamics moving around that day, but I know I concentrated on the well-being of our officer at the hospital, making sure that he was getting the treatment that he needed, as well as both physically and mentally and emotionally, to get him and his family on that path to healing. And I know the other chiefs that were involved that day had the same thing for their officers and said, unfortunately, one of our peers, fellow chiefs, started that day having to start thinking about how to deal with a family of a fallen officer and starting to plan memorial services and things along that line.
Yeah. And if that was all that happened that year in terms of a serious incident, this would be, a conversation very worth having right now, but it wasn't. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what happens in this next interim time before another incident also is just really quite unbelievable. But I want to bring Chief Stephan in here for some perspective, what was going through your mind, and maybe at what point you began to interact with Chief Lash.
A couple of pieces to that puzzle, so to speak, that came
Mhm.
together to illustrate the continuity of response. As Chief Lash mentioned, the CISM teams in place and used from the Pennsylvania State Police, who are tremendous partners, just certainly are. The other thing was, and it was kind of fortunate, we had a very, very responsive district attorney's office and office of the attorney general, both of whom we are familiar with as York County prosecutors, and tremendous confidence level in those two individuals. And they made it clear from the outset that this was a situation where the police acted responsibly and within the law. And that's a big
Mhm.
area that takes a lot of stress off of the police officers that are involved immediately. This is very unusual. In fact, I think it was unprecedented to have such a pronouncement within several hours. A lot of those pieces were in place. Now, the other part you asked, the defusing piece that Chief Lash was talking about, over my time, I'm very close with Dave. I know I'm close with a lot of the officers that were there when I was there and got to know some of the new guys. And the fact of the matter is, I called Dave up within an hour and a half because I didn't want to bother him in the heat of things and said, "Are you okay? And are your officers okay?" Because at that point, we didn't know, it wasn't made public who the officer was. It was mortally wounded. The bottom line is you don't stop caring, you don't stop communicating, and you take care of each other. And that's important.
Well, I'd like to hear more about just that year, that process. I know, again, you can go back through, which I did, and there's a lot of coverage following that event. But there is another event that happened in September. If you could talk about that, and maybe again, just how is the groundwork being laid here for sort of a different way of thinking, particularly for maybe some of your younger officers? I'm not sure whether it impacted your younger or your older officers more. Maybe it was the same, but talk a little bit about what happened next.
Yeah, and I think you just have to look historically at 2025, and then I'll get into September. In 2025, there were 14 law enforcement officers shot in the line of duty in Pennsylvania. 8 of those officers were from York County. 4 of them were fatal. 5 of those officers shot were members of our agency, Northern York County Regional Police Officers. So 2025 is a year that will be, infamous in our organization forever and ever and memorialized as it should be. But, we get through the UPMC shooting, we get our officer back to work rather quickly. He heals rather quickly. He has a desire to get back to work, and he's back to work by the middle of April. So less than 2 months, he's out with his wounds healing, and he comes back to work. And we're talking about wellness. We're getting ready on the state level for the PA chiefs who wants this new wellness app. our wellness page and resources. And so it's fresh on everybody's minds. And we're making sure that our officers are checking on each other. And as we continue through, time heals all wounds. And by end of August, beginning of September, we're right on the verge of moving into our new facility, our new station. Everybody's on a high note. You're talking about how things are going to operate in the new building. And then along comes September 17th of 2025. And it's a day that I don't think either Dave or I will ever forget. I was in a meeting coming out of the UPMC shooting. A local business had held a fundraising concert in June of 2025. And one of the things that was coming out of that concert was to raise funds to build a shoot house, if you will, a tactical training center here in York County. And our agency just happened to have the space available to host that tactical training center. And I had come out of that meeting with the planning for that. And the building that we have that meeting in, there's not a lot of cell service. It's kind of a dead zone. So a lieutenant and I walked out of that meeting, and as soon as we hit the air, as soon as we hit the sunshine, both of our phones started going off because after UPMC, the county had initiated a new app on our phones for police leadership that advises us of major incidents that are occurring. And I can remember vividly looking down at my phone. I heard this go up, read multiple officers down, multiple officers wounded, North Codorus Township. Well, North Codorus Township is one of our municipalities. I knew that our detectives had been out at a house that morning trying to serve an arrest warrant, but more importantly, they were there trying to verify that the suspect was not there so that we could get the victim and her mother back into the house. And, your head starts racing, your heart starts sinking at the same time. And, what really had happened that day is the night before we had a patrol incident where our patrol officers were out at this address in North Codorus Township investigating a domestic. A female was being stalked. They caught on a game camera what they believed to be the stalker carrying a rifle through their fields. So our patrol officers had responded out there 10:30, 11 o'clock the previous night, unable to locate this individual, but did find his vehicle and had it towed. So our criminal investigators the next morning were following up on that and had already served a search warrant at the subject's house in a neighboring jurisdiction and were able to find him. So they made the decision to go to this house, the original house, and to make sure it was clear for the mother and the victim to come back to the house. As they cleared the outbuildings and approached the main house, 3 of our officers went to the front door. The other 2 were kind of flanking the rear and the side of the home. They determined that the front door was unlocked. This was contrary to reports from patrol the night before. Patrol had made sure the house was locked when they left, and they made a conscious decision to open that door. And when they did, they were met with an ambush with a subject armed with a semi-automatic rifle. The 3 officers that were originally at the door were killed fairly instantaneously. The subject emerged from the house, engaged our 4th officer, who was shot twice. Fortunately, he kind of fell backwards and landed in some shrubbery and was kind of out of sight and out of mind. So then the assailant then turned his attention to a York County Sheriff's deputy that was on scene assisting us and engaged that sheriff's deputy in fire. And that allowed our 5th detective that was on scene, who was armed with a rifle, to come around from the back of the house and be able to engage the assailant and eventually neutralize him. And that 5th detective then went into rescue mode. We kind of talked about that after UPMC and went down, applied a tourniquet to our officer that was injured, applied a tourniquet to the York County Sheriff's deputy, and saved their lives as other officers were responding in at that point because it had happened so fast, nobody was really even able to get on the radio until it was over. The entire event lasted less than 2 minutes, 2 minutes of hell, as I call it. Next thing you know, we're hearing people calling for helicopters and ambulances to fly injured officers out.
I don't know how you move past an event like that. I mean, just to hear you tell it and imagine how that is in your mind in that much detail is really, it's moving and chilling. It's a chilling picture. And I can see that the department would be, from a chief perspective, you're thinking, how do you lead forward? So, and then you need, you need your support too. I'm imagining this is where Chief Stephan becomes, again, a big part of your experience. But it's just this idea that you're the person that's supposed to lead now. And you must have felt really...
Yeah, and you kind of go on, at least I did anyway, on the way to the scene. You have all these thoughts racing through your heads and what
Hmm.
assistance you need and who you need to be there. And it was probably a 10-minute drive for me to get to the scene. And I made about 6 phone calls. 3 of them I remember.
Hmm.
And I've had people come up to me and say, I talked to you on that day. I have no recollection of
Yeah, it's
talking to
very
you.
interesting.
I called the colonel of the Pennsylvania State Police, Chris Paris, at the time, telling him that we're going to need some help. I called Natalie Watkin, who's a corporal with the Pennsylvania State Police Members Assistance Program, telling her what was going on and that we needed some help. One of the other calls I actually remember making was to one of our chaplains, knowing that we were going to need chaplain services at our station that evening for our officers and our families. Like I said, there was other calls I made that day. I was supposed to be at an appointment the following day that I wasn't going to make it to, but it just all runs together. And then getting to the scene and starting to have it unpack and unwind. And that's when you're able to start making those secondary and tertiary calls. And I know Dave was one of those calls I made while we were out there, just about bringing our family together to help deal with that. We had an outpouring of support from our retirees, our active duty, and our families showing up at the hospital, showing up for each other and coming to the station that night. Nobody quite knew what we were supposed to do. Nobody
Yeah.
quite knew how we were supposed to react, but everybody knew we were supposed to be together. And I think that was the key point to what happened on that day.
I'd like to ask Chief Stephan to reflect on this a little bit because I am imagining that there's all this preparation you go through, I mean, your mind and so forth, when you have to go to a scene where there are victims. But when those victims are your peers, those people that you work with. And so I'm wondering, Chief Stephan, if you can reflect a little bit about what is happening to the best of your ability inside you. You could speak for yourself and maybe your sense of what was happening that maybe had not happened before, that was
Well,
something new.
certainly, as Chief Lash mentioned, when you have the travel time on the way to a critical event, you're going through different scenarios in your mind about the
Hmm.
needs assessment, the resources, and things like that. But when you get there and you see an officer from your agency that is being killed, we had an officer struck by a woman putting on her makeup while traveling down Route 15. The fact of the matter is, it always takes it one step back when you see one of your officers in your uniforms lying deceased. And that's a difficult thing. But you have to do what you got to do at the scene. Part of resiliency is keeping control and getting through that piece, having the strength and the ability to make it through those difficult periods. And then the pathway gets a little bit wider later on for some of the other things that come into it. But in this particular case, this news travels fast. I was getting all kinds of phone calls from retirees and guys that were working for the regional police in Lancaster because we did a lot of cross training with Northern York. And the joke is our keys fit their doors. We were actually called a franchise at one point by one of our colleagues because our uniforms and everything looked almost identical. To tell you what kind of police subculture there is, as this was going on, I looked up and in my living room was a couple of my officers asking what we needed.
Wow.
It's just difficult. That was probably the worst part of that day for me because I wasn't involved in the other part. But, that's the kind of relationship that you should have in policing. And we had
Yeah.
it. We were fortunate to have that. Now,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
next
It
day,
brings it all home.
yeah. Well, the next day, though, it really hit it. When we were out along Route 222, they had a procession with the ambulance transporting these fallen officers for their autopsies in the Lehigh Valley Medical Center. And there was a host of police cars and along Route 222 to honor these guys. And as soon as I got done there, came back to the house and my phone rang and it was Dave. And he just said 3 words, I need help.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very moving. And I think what is in my mind when I think of you two, and again, I know Chief Stephan for a longer period of time, but knowing what sort of an original thinker he is as a chief and thinking that you're bringing this together, what I want to talk about is sort of this journey that you went on, you were willing to go on, that really is much bigger than this. I don't want to get too philosophical, but is that relationship that makes you realize what is your real strength and resilience as a team. And so you begin to think about bigger ways this could impact through wellness. And so this next segment that I want to really move to is how you begin to formulate in your mind what this might mean if you could make this wellness piece more central to policing. And I really don't know exactly what that looked like, but it seems to have really landed well. And so that's why I'd like you to describe what that can look like in a department. You don't need to have a tragedy to have
No.
really effective wellness program.
But first of all, guys that are in leadership positions in policing understand the value of this and really have to figure out a way to non-stigmatize some of the things that we got to do. I can give you a real quick example. I had a person I sent to our qualified mental health professional. He went there for what I sent a letter to him ordering him to go as a team building exercise. And he thought he was going to go see somebody for coaching to success. And he got there and saw the shingle hanging on the door. And he came back and stormed into my office, berating me for sending him to see a psychologist. And he says, "You called it a team building exercise." And my response was, "Well, you got to call it something." And the fact of the matter is, we understood the value of these things. So after critical events, officers were standing with a guy who suddenly produced a weapon and shot himself and killed himself right in front of the officers. Right away, qualified mental health professionals notified that night they get to talk to him. The next day they get to talk to him. And that Monday, they're cleared to come back to work because they worked through it right from the start. Those are the kinds of things that are invaluable because these officers are very, very well trained, and it costs a tremendous amount of time, money, and effort to get a well-trained, experienced officer, and you want to take care of your people. The other thing is, with our policies, we have all kinds of names for emotionally disturbed persons or EDPs, qualified mental health professionals. Yeah, there's a lot of nice euphemisms you can use, but you got to take away the stigma. And you, most importantly, also have to track what are these precipitating events and how's it going to affect this officer's performance and their health. And that's why we track some of these things. It's not a gotcha, but we have to make certain that we provide them adequate risk management control for them and the agency. And it's the right thing to do because these are valued employees.
What would you add to that?
Yeah, wellness is, I think we talked earlier for the last 5 or 6 years, it's been on the forefront. We had Act 59 came out of the legislature back in 2021, which, started requiring some of these mandatory visits following officer-involved shootings and use of deadly force. And, that really started the conversation of what more can we do? Because you don't want to do the bare minimum. You want to continue to make sure that your officers have the tools ahead of time to deal with these situations, not just play defense and see what we can do afterwards. So those conversations have been ongoing, and here in York County, we had a neighboring agency in Newberry Township a few years ago, get a grant that we were able to provide for their officers to have mandatory mental health wellness checks twice a year. We were working through that process as a county-wide through our County Chiefs Association to bring that process to all of York County and all of York County's officers for 2026. And the events of 2025 amplified that effort and got us even working harder towards that goal, to the point that without even funding being in place, we were able as an agency here to see the benefits of that. And we started our mandatory mental health wellness checks here in 2026, where every officer and every civilian staff member for that has to go to 2 mental health wellness checks a year with providers that we have vetted at the organizational level.
There's a couple quotes here that I really appreciate from our prep call, Chief Lash. One is that we're thinking about wellness in the totality, not just mental wellness. So in that larger sense, I think back of the 20, 30 years ago when I began working with police departments, fitness was about the gym, which is very much a part of wellness, but it is a much bigger concept here, the way you're exploring it. Now, another quote you said, as a police officer who's having a rough time at home usually comes to work and has a rough time at work. If we can help them work through problems at home, they become more productive police officers.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. You're right on. A lot of wellness conversations move strictly to mental health, and there's so many more facets to that, whether it's physical health, whether it's emotional health, financial health, family health. We're expanding now, fortunate enough as an agency to get a grant through the IACP to expand a family wellness program so that we're not only just reaching out to our officers, but we're building that culture and that wellness culture out through our families. Because as you said, if they're not happy at home, they're not going to be happy at work. And if they're not happy at work, they're not going to be happy at home. we need to find that balance and make sure that we're addressing all the issues that are out there and providing them the assistance that they need. We're hiring young people as police officers. Some of them have never been, lived on their own. Some of them have never, I say balance a checkbook because half of them don't even know what a checkbook is. But, we're trying to provide that totality of wellness surrounding our officers and allowing them to become the best version of themselves that they can.
Let's talk about what that looks like. I would describe it as kind of a hybrid approach. And I'm curious as I was reading over my notes, some of this or a little bit of this is AI, would you say? I mean, there is like a wraparound depending on what the person feels comfortable with. Is that right? Whether it's in person or something else that coaches you through.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of options. So the mental health wellness checks, those have to be in person.
Mhm.
We want somebody, and we're doing that for the reason is we're trying to build rapport with our officers, with someone, a professional that they can feel comfortable with. So if they're having a bad day, if they're having an issue, we're able to make a quick phone call to that therapist or social worker or whoever they have talked to in the past, and potentially work through it on the phone. So we want them to have that rapport, someone that they can call. And we just had an incident very similar to that last week here in-house. An
Mhm.
officer came to work, said he wasn't quite feeling himself, wasn't feeling up to working, had some issues he needed to work through with somebody. And we were able to get one of our providers on the phone, and she was able to get him in immediately. And after spending a couple hours with her, he was able to come back the next day to work and have a productive weekend. But that's, to be honest with you, something we wouldn't have done 2 years ago.
I don't think we said at the beginning how many officers you have
We
in
have
your
69.
and who would they actually go to say, I want to explore some options for wellness? I'm not sure how they might
Yeah,
say.
we have a wellness committee. We have a wellness coordinator.
Oh.
It's one of our sergeants. And we have various tools available for the officers, whether it's mentoring, coaching platforms, wellness apps that you can do anonymously, and then we're working through this grant. And then we have these live in-person visits that they can go make or people that they can actually call. Last week, this officer that had came in spoke to his sergeant and said, something's off today. I need to talk to somebody. And that sergeant was able to make a phone call to one of our providers and set up that meeting and turned out to be able to get that officer back on track and back to work.
Yeah. I want to ask Chief Stephan, because I know it's somewhere in these notes that there might be a reduction in use of force if that actually is a possible metric. Of course, you do track use of force statistics. Is there some correlation or ability to see increased attention to wellness as a way to disrupt what could be triggering behaviors?
Well, a couple of ways I'd like to approach that. But one of the things that Chief Lash mentioned earlier about the wellness coordinator being a sergeant, that's a great
Mhm.
job. That's a great thing. I know how he's going to operate this. He's going to have that be a rotating position as a supervisor, get into the mindset
Mhm.
of executive management and having that become another piece of the succession planning for an organization, which is just amazing. I
Great
salute
point.
you.
Great point.
To your original question, I just got done actually reading a paper on that with resiliency and talking about use of force reductions and things. I don't know that there's enough data been analyzed by that. A lot of it seems to be anecdotal, but I do believe that it's probably a direct link. If you have a problem at home or you had a problem with interagency relations or things like that, and you went to work upset, there's always that guy that's going to come along that lets you take your day out on him. And you just don't need that aggravation. It makes the
Mhm.
agency look bad. It makes you look bad, and it's just not worth it. Oh, there's a lot to this wellness piece. We actually used it. We would have our mental health professional talk to people about team building before we gave promotional exams, because there's always guys or people that get promoted and people that don't. And going in with a positive attitude. And then afterwards, we had them come in and talk to them again, because we knew that there was going to be people that had some residual issues with it. And it certainly seemed to blunt that and made any kind of transition period a lot shorter.
I'd love to know if mindfulness is something that's talked about at all. It's something I have found extremely helpful in my own life. I'm just curious whether that has been introduced.
Yeah, Nancy, that's absolutely part of our wellness checks. And that was part of our vetting process for our professionals is as to what therapies they use and mindfulness. And a lot of that is involved in all three of the providers. And our officers are buying into that. And when one officer has success with it, that just breeds additional success for the rest of the officers.
Right.
Chief Stefan and I can sit up here and talk about all the good things we should be doing or we have done. But until you get that officer buy-in and you get some of those informal leaders coming back from these wellness checks or talking openly about having a therapist, once you get that conversation started, then you really know that you've kind of won over the top. And now you're on the side where it's going to start become more and more accepted and just part of your culture.
Yeah.
That was a big point for us, is people just starting more openly talking about it.
Very good, important point. Whenever you conduct an internal survey of an organization from a management perspective,
Mhm.
one of the key essential findings is going to be, does that employee feel valued by the organization? And do they feel like they have management listening to their concerns? And more importantly than that, do they feel that they can come forward with a novel or new idea? That's important. And, this buy-in, if you don't have it, you're not going to get many new programs through, because you have to have a basis for it. You have to have the expectations. And the fact of the matter is, I love the idea of having that as a metric for surveys internally.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about that resistance and how that shows up, because I think that's another area that listeners, if they want to do something like this, are going to want to know how you have responded to some of those who resisted. But I also don't want to miss a point that Chief Lash made, which is, I have seen in so many organizations that when one person really is transformed or really feels better about themselves and comes into work more whole, right there, you have just introduced a factor, a larger wellness picture. So it's that feeling of wanting to go to work and be around people. I don't
Yep.
want to miss that. There's a compounding effect. But let's talk about the resistance, because even in that environment where there is this sorts of resistance, anything that you can offer, let's start with Chief Lash. I'd like to hear what Chief Stefan has to say. What are some ways that you would advise if somebody's saying there's just within the ranks some that won't go, won't
Yeah,
come?
it's not a one size fits all approach. Just like grieving is, we all don't take the same path. We all don't have the same resiliency. We all don't have the same time frame to where we get beyond things. And, and we're still seeing that here 6 months after the fact, nearly 7 months after the fact. We have officers that have and want to move on, and they really don't want to talk about this. They never want to forget, but they also don't want to be constantly reminded of it every day. And then we have officers that are still struggling. Those are the ones that we're helping to work through their problems now and trying to find new ways to reach out and make contact with them to get it to a point where they're comfortable with it or they're becoming the best version of themselves. And that's very difficult to do, is to find that perfect match for everybody. That's why when we went out for the mental health wellness checks, we used 3 different providers, because some of our officers were using providers. The county program wanted to use a single set of providers, but we had met so many people during 2025 and therapists during 2025 that we wanted to make sure that we had a broad enough spectrum of therapists that we could find the right fit, hopefully, for every one of our people. We made it mandatory. When you go on duty, we will pay you to go to it. So that takes away the part of I don't want to go, because they have to go. That's a direct order from the chief of police. You have to go. They can't say no because we're paying them to go. But we have officers that have gone, have come back, thought it was worthwhile, are continuing to see these professionals and seeing some benefit out of it. But we still have some people that are pushing back, people that are making some jokes out of it, that thinks that it's some sort of inside information track from the therapist to the chief of police. And we take those hurdles one at a time as they come to us. Those people, officers that tend to have that mindset, are normally of an older generation, and they don't want to be big brothered, where our younger generation of officers are oftentimes embracing it and, are thankful that the organization cares about their well-being.
Yeah, I believe you when you say it's the older generation. I really do.
And I'm one of them, right? It's like, me go see a
Yeah.
therapist? Come on.
Yeah, we
Well,
get out of control. We are apologizing for it. I mean, in terms of emotional,
Yeah.
like there's something here that's not right.
well, I can
We have
tell
to
you,
work.
as a guy that was kind of through some of this, when I took the job as a police chief, I had to go through the MOPEC certification process again. And part of that was I had to take a psychological examination. I have to tell you, after 35 years as a police officer, I wasn't sure how that was going to fly, but I came out on the right end of it. There's certain anxieties associated with that. I think it's just managing those expectations. 100 officers that go through what their organization went through. A reasonable expectation is you're going to have a drop off. There's going to be a percentage that you can't reach no matter what you're going to do as far as intervention. They're going to trit out of the organization just because of all the things that they've been exposed to. It's just the way it is with family pressures or internal pressures. I think it's just a good thing to have as part of your resiliency as organization. Have a realistic set of expectations.
Well said. I think that that's a very good way to look at it. And having a realistic expectation means you don't have to get hung up on that you kind of just keep moving forward and keep that sense of belief in what you're doing. And I think this is an important place for us to, in this last segment, wrap around this whole idea of what's happening within the police agency is also impacting the community. Fact, impacting local government in general. I think that I have seen in local governments where it is the police department that can actually set a higher bar for some aspects of leadership. And I think this is an example that would be really a wonderful way for people to think about not just what's happening in the police department, but what's happening in the bigger picture. So I'd like some comments on this. And I'm talking about this with some others in podcasts that have to do with mining, other industries. And it has to do with that, getting over the fear of speaking out, getting over this sense of there is danger, but nobody's going to talk about that, or something is unsafe in the environment. So just thinking about how the idea of wellness can be, what is the metaphor? How does that impact the local government, the community? In your eyes, how do you see that bridge?
Question. I like it when you have good questions.
Take your time.
I think what we're seeing, and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about use of force, not a lot of research out there, as David said, but I think when we have officers who are well balanced, well integrated into their communities, we're going to see the benefits of that on the community side of it as well. Like David said earlier, we have a huge community support in our municipalities. And the tragedies of 2025 only brought the community and the police department closer together. And I recognize the fact we're a different animal because we're necessarily tied to one municipality or one township government or one fire department. We're kind of our own entity in and of itself.
Yeah.
The outpouring of support that we saw from our community, that we continue to see from our community, we know that the community has our back. And we want to make sure that we're putting officers on the street that has the community's back, and that we're putting out there the best well-rounded, physically, emotionally well-rounded officers that we can to help them get through their issues. Because if we can't deal with the officers and get them to that position where they're dealing with their own problems and issues in an outward manner, how do we expect them to be able to help the community through similar issues? And, I think that's the overarching theme of this wellness and this safety culture, is that big picture. And how does us getting our officers in the right frame of mind carry over into the community and make the community a better place?
Yeah, I love that.
As a regional chief, you're in charge of your entire budget and your entire operational situation. And my first thought when Dave started talking about this was, boy, I bet that line item got blown out of the water in 2025. It sounds frivolous, but that's where you have buy-in from your community leadership saying, okay, we're going to invest money in this proactively as opposed to reactively. And I think that's very, very important fact, because when you develop budgets, municipal leaders are always looking at things that they have to do and want to do. I would put this in the have to do category.
I'd agree with that. I spoke to the York County Association of Township Supervisors, ironically, last year on wellness, and that wellness needs to be part of your budget, needs to be part of your community, needs to be part. It's not a luxury. It has to be a mainstay in your organization. I think our budget for 2026 was pretty well by the time the September tragedy happened. So I look forward to, and I've already started working with our elected officials, our 2027 budget is going to have a very sizable line item for officer wellness. And there's some things out there yet that we want to do and we need to do. Even creating, I was talking to a chief the other day from California, and, they put a Zen room in their station.
Love that.
And where an officer can go. Maybe it has a massage chair in it. If you're having a particularly bad situation and you need a place you can go decompress, the officers go into the Zen room and just decompress for a half hour to get their mind back where they need to be. There's a lot of innovative stuff going out there in the country. It does take some money, but a lot of it is relatively inexpensive, and it just comes right down to how you're dealing with your officers and the culture that's involved.
What I see in this change of culture is that for so long, just in an overall general way, we hear about police departments, just as we do governments, about the external. We started the external, it's the cars, it's the equipment, there's all of these external things that are sort of intended to radiate and project out a sense of good governance and good, services. But what we're talking about today, it's an internal language, and it has to do with building a strong internal core. This is more my field, of organization development and leadership, is that you're really beginning with your core, and that is actually what's radiating out and creating what I think, describing in the community is felt. It's felt. Nobody feels a building. Nobody feels a shiny new car. I mean, the community, what they feel is that presence. And that's very intangible and hard. And I think what the work is creating those connections in that community that are hard to measure, but really you can get people to talk about it. Those are stories you can tell.
Absolutely.
I love having you both here today. Chief Stephan, any closing thoughts that you'd like to, maybe we've missed, or something is on your mind right now?
Let me just make it clear that these are techniques and things that worked for us. Or may not be transferable to other agencies, but every agency should at least have some consideration of a wellness plan, particularly as it appears to coincide with their early warning collection system. All these things are just hand in hand, and no matter what size the agency is, they're important key metrics that you have to measure and track.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're going to leave it right here. And I want to thank you again for being these wonderful guests. And thank you, Chief Lash, for sharing. I know that was not easy to do, but I think it helps us all to understand the journey that you all have been on and how wonderful it is to have your collegial friendship with Chief Stephan that goes back so many years. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.